I refute the claim that social media improves relationships. My opponent supports this claim by first stating that social media improves relationships through online chatting. Second, that social media maintains relationships, and finally, that social media simplifies the process of mass organization without the burden of unnecessary tangible meetings. My opponent states that there is an abundance of research in favor of these claims, but does not present enough research to support these claims. This leads me to believe that these claims lack validity due to the lack of evidence provided. My opponent also gathered most of his information from one source only. The source that was used was the cons of social media. The first claim states that social media improves relationships through online chatting. The opponent supports this claim by stating that social media prepares us for real-life conversations. I do not believe that social media improves relationships because face-to-face interactions are not real-life conversations. Social media does not prepare an individual for real-life conversations because it is not face-to-face. Approaching someone in person is different from communicating with someone online. Social skills also limit the opportunity for communication. Communication skills cannot be improved within an online environment. According to psychologist Sally Ann Williams, online interactions lack the nonverbal cues that are a component of face-to-face content, and this may reduce the extent of communication that it stirs. Also, social media, if you communicate behind the computer screen, you miss the verbal cues and like the facial expressions that person's giving you, so it limits your room for communication. People tend to only visit websites that share the same opinions and interests as them, which creates narrow-minded communication. Social media ruins relationships by increasing narcissism and decreasing empathy. According to Time magazine, a study found that students are 40% less empathetic than they were 30 years ago, thanks to on-screen interactions that make it easier to say mean things before considering their actions. The second claim states that social media maintains relationships. My opponent supports this claim by stating that it keeps relationships regardless of distance. My opponent states that text messaging helps family and friends stay connected, which is a site that text messaging is not considered social media. According to Webster Dictionary, social media is any form of communication between people and the internet. According to psychologist Lindsay Shaw, internet usage is a private and solitary activity. Also, social media can harm relationships by announcing activities online. This can lead to a person feeling left out because they were not invited to participate in the activity. Social media encourages the hoarding of family and friends in order to appear socially active. According to researcher Brian Wall, the human brain can only actively maintain 150 relationships. This makes it impossible for individuals to actively communicate with all of their online followers. The third claim states that social media simplifies the process of mass organization without the burden of unnecessary tangible meetings. My opponent supports this claim by stating that event pages can be set up and people can be added without calling. I do not believe that social media simplifies the process of mass organization without the burden of tangible meetings. Adding people to your social group still requires their approval and requires some sort of form of communication in order to get their email address, phone number, or personal contact information, which requires communication between the two individuals. My opponent's final statement is that social media positively reinforces face-to-face communication. I believe that online communication does not reinforce face-to-face communication because individuals become more dependent on online communication. To review my opponent's claims that social media improves relationships, the support provided states that social media improves relationships through online chatting. This type of communication does not prepare an individual for real-life conversations. Second, support states that social media maintains relationships. Although social media encourages the hoarding of family and friends in order to appear socially active, the brain can only actively maintain 150 relationships at a time. The final support states that social media simplifies the process of mass organization without the burden of unnecessary tangible meetings. In order to communicate, you must first come in contact with that person to receive their personal information.
Okay, just put it right there.
Okay.
Thank you. right, the structure I think starts off pretty clear with the main and secondary claims being labeled, but I did think in the body of the speech that you got a little bit lost after that second point. It sounded like there were 3 or 4 responses that you were dealing with after the second point, and they weren't as distinctly signposted or transition to as the first 2 points were. On the first point, I thought that you had a reasonable argument about there being a difference between social media and face-to-face interaction. You've got a piece of information from a psychologist that says that they're lacking the nonverbal cues and that sort of thing, so that makes sense. There's some other data here that you have that I think makes for an interesting argument, but you rush through the data and you don't really emphasize what the conclusion of that data is. So you've got a statistic that says that teenagers, I think it was, are 40% less empathetic than they were 30 years ago. Well, that's an interesting piece of information. I don't know how they developed it, but what does that mean to our ability to communicate and understand one another? I don't think that you slow down to explain that. You've just got the next thing that you're going to, and sometimes you have to emphasize some of these points. I know it's kind of, all right, there you are. It's a little smarmy for me to say this, so I apologize ahead of time. But when you're talking about face-to-face interaction and communication, and what you're doing is reading, and you're not really looking at and talking to people, it kind of undermines the credibility part of the argument. You need to look at people and say, look, according to this research, teenagers are 40% less empathetic. That means that they don't relate to people, they don't understand them, they can't sympathize with those situations. How can that be a real relationship? That's the way, you gotta have to explain what the argument means, not just list a talking point on the issue. And I thought that that was a little bit problematic because I got a lot of those talking points, and they were good talking points, and you had good evidence on those points, but you need to make them arguments yourself, and it just doesn't. The presentation, I think, is one of the things that is divisive there. Let's go back to those nonverbal cues that were being mentioned before. You need to have the expression on your face or the tone in your voice that indicates that you see this as being pretty damning to the use of social media in this situation. And it just sounds like a text message. So it needs to be a little bit more emphatic. I appreciate the idea that the text message isn't social media, but I really didn't understand why your definitions prove that particular point. I think it's an interesting argument to make, but I don't know what it gets you. And if you are correct, what part of the advocate's argument focused on text messaging? That was not particularly clear. I can see that you followed the structure really clearly, and you were making a good effort to respond to all the individual points, and I think that makes a little bit of sense, but you also have to ask yourself, what's the value of responding to those particular points? And I think that was missing on a couple of the points. All right. I know I sounded like I was awfully critical, but you had good stuff in the speech too. I did say that. I think you need to work on the presentation a lot. All right, thank you.